Thank you for the opportunity to share today about supply chain sustainability and human rights risk management. Now, as I go through this presentation, I'm sure you'll hear themes already addressed by our two previous speakers. And as time is limited, I'm going to go quickly and stay at a high level. I'm not going to explicate every detail on each slide, but I'm happy to address all questions in the Q&A period. And of course, we're happy to follow up with you directly after this call. Again, thank you to Jipyong for enabling this presentation, and thank you for your kind attention. Today, I'd like to focus my comments on three questions. What is supply chain sustainability? How should companies build systems and solutions? And where can companies find the ROI, the return on investment for this work? This way, I hope we have a shared understanding of what we're talking about, a beginning of how to address the topic, and how this could create value for your company. So let's start with the first question. What is supply chain sustainability? Well, let's start with a simple definition. I think everyone on this call knows what a supply chain is. And let's put ourselves in the seat of the buyer. The supply chain is what your company activates through its purchasing decisions. Supply chain sustainability refers to the effective management of ethical, social, and environmental impacts created and caused through the extension of the supplier network. Impacts that are related to the purchasing decision your company makes. This includes not only suppliers from whom you purchase directly, but those below them in your tier 2 and tier 3 and beyond. So what are some of the ethical, social, and environmental impacts? Well, here are just a few, and we'll talk about others later and have talked about many already. In short, how your supply chain treats its employees, respects the community environment it operates in, and meets its legal and ethical obligations. Let's also be clear from the very beginning. Supply chain sustainability is about how these considerations are integrated into your procurement processes and directly related to your supply chain strategy and relationships, and your quality, price, and delivery expectations. All are interrelated. Okay, so you might ask, okay, but what does this mean? I understand I want to avoid bad things in my supply chain, but actually avoiding bad, not getting in an accident, isn't actually a strategy. Where are you going to? That's more interesting and the more important question. What does good look like as we think about sustainable supply chains? Well, for BSR, this means supply chains that are efficient, equitable, transparent, and sustainable. Okay, so what is driving this push towards sustainable supply chains? First, let's start with the obvious. COVID's impact has exposed how efficiency in global supply chains has come at the cost of resilience and sustainability. This has underscored how many companies have allowed lowest cost to blind them to risk, resilience, and the other impacts of their supply chain. Second, there's been a steadily greater coverage of sustainability, greater transparency about global supply chains, and greater clarity on the impact of the supply chains, as you've already heard. Third, as you've heard from Rosa, the business and human rights landscape is developing and building expectations for corporate understanding of their human rights impacts. In other words, how companies and their supply chains impact people and their human rights. Supply chain human rights impacts are fundamental to understanding of your supply chain sustainability aspects. The focus on human rights is causing an evolution of national requirements, as you've heard, for human rights due diligence, which is both about your company and its supply chain and requires you to increasingly understand the detailed operations which your supply chain partners exhibit. Even more specifically, as Rosa has begun to outline, the focus on human rights and modern slavery is impacting laws regarding modern slavery and the due diligence requirements. And in this case, Again, we're talking about both your company and its supply chain. To put a sharp point on it, the point being your access to markets. U.S. and Customs and Border Protection states that not only that you have to avoid forced labor, which includes raw materials of your product like cotton or silicone, but that you should be able to demonstrate that the merchandise was not produced with forced labor. In short, there are diverse stakeholders that are pushing for more supply chain transparency, due diligence, and accountability. And that doesn't even include a key question for you on this phone. What are your customers' expectations, both now and in the future? As you look downstream to whom you sell, what will those future expectations be? And what does this mean about how and to whom you sell will be increasingly impacted by how and from whom you buy? Okay, so that's the imperative. Why you should be paying attention to this topic and investing in it. The next question companies usually ask is, okay, how? What do I do? The first part of the answers go back to first principles. Supply chains are fundamentally about relationships. All purchasing decisions require two voluntary parties, and this is important to build into any approach. Second, as you've already heard, there are laws. You're not starting from zero. There are laws, guidance, standards, and norms which have been developed over the past 2 decades. You can and should use this knowledge. The third question is for you. What do you want to achieve? What is your company's ambition? How does your company frame the future? What is important, not just today, but in 5 years? That's actually what BSR's supply chain leadership ladder was created to answer. It's a maturity model for supply chain sustainability, which allows you to take steps up the leadership ladder as you mature your strategy. The question your company needs to answer is, how do you move from building awareness about the issues, like we're doing here today, to actually tackling the issues, mitigating them, and turning your supply chain into a strategic asset? To be clear, this is more than an audit, more than an inspection, and requires organizational alignment to achieve. Your organizational alignment enables levers you can control and processes you can invest in, which allow you to influence and build the supply chain you want to see. These include practices inside your company and directly under control, as well as practices which influence external organizations, including suppliers and their workforce, industry participants, and related stakeholders. The process to get started isn't actually complicated, but does require the ability to assess your current state, prioritize what you think is important, and plan next steps. Building a strategy to achieve your desired outcome needs to be built on transparency. What is your supply chain? Where is it? What are the relevant risks and impacts? From social and human rights risks and impacts to environmental and governance issues and risks and impacts. You need to understand how these pertain to you, and then you need to get work implementing and iterating. Often this leads to 2 key improvement cycles. Both are important to how you manage supply chain sustainability as well as human rights. The first is outwardly focused. How do you create a continuous improvement cycle with your supply chain to achieve your expected outcomes? The second is, how do you build internal management for both human rights and supply chain issues to ensure you have the management systems to implement your expectations, as well as remediation systems to deal with the issues which inevitably arise? Remember, the supply chains are fundamentally about relationships. Work to create win-win integrate these into your purchasing functions, and collaborate to evolve the outcomes you desire. Okay, so you do all this work. Where's the ROI? First, the ROI sits in the supply chain operations itself. You should be able to create increased resilience and decreased risk by explicitly addressing these in your strategy. These have corporate value, and unfortunately, many companies fail to fully account for these values. How are you going to impact your Scope 3 emissions? Well, through this engagement process. Use your increased transparency, efficiency, and accountability to find reputational returns. Second, integrate sustainability into your supply chain finance operations and use these to create win-win opportunities for both your company and your supply chain. We have a report which can be found on the BSR website if you're interested in learning more. Finally, your ROI should be found in brand and product. You can integrate your supply chain investments into your brand. Lou and Gray does via their engagement with her project. And you can use your supply chain practices to demonstrate how trust, ethical behavior, and accountability are fundamental to your value proposition. You can also integrate your supply chain strategy into your product offerings, whether it is how they're described via an online platform, or as H&M does, explicitly link the product to the supply chain and how your company manages that supply chain. Particularly as more retail moves online, I would expect greater consumer ease, clicking a link, to enable greater transparency and product level engagement on ethical supply chains to be key in the future. At the broader level, what we're beginning to clearly see is how you buy, your supply chain practices are influencing what you can sell where and to whom. And in the future, as this becomes increasingly important, it will shift as the expectations in your supply chain move towards dictating what you sell. The market expectations of your product and by your customers will determine how you buy in terms of the expected ethical, social, environmental, and governance practices and expectations in your supply chain. Thank you very much for your time and attention. I look forward to all questions, and thank you very much.